I'd like to introduce to you someone who is no stranger to experimentation. Esther Dyson. I've heard about you, Esther, the first time when I was doing my PhD program a while ago during the dot-com boom. And at that point, I was getting sucked into the boom and considered leaving my PhD program a couple times. It was tough. It was tough going because when you're a PhD student, you're either a very badly paid employee or you're just a badly paid employee, basically. And I saw all my friends running out to Silicon Valley working for 18 months and becoming billionaires, because of course, that's how this stuff works. And I started reading some of your work at the time and was really inspired by it. So when Brian Campen, where's Brian? So Brian with XCore, Brian brought Andrew, the Chief Operating Officer of XCore last year, you might recall, and also Lee Shapiro, whom I don't think is here today, but he's been with us. There's Lee, all the way in the back. Lee Shapiro helped introduce it. We sort of conspired together to get Esther to join us. So very excited. When you're in the tech space, you know Esther Dyson. So what we've asked her to do is say a little bit about Hiccup, your current mission, and then, of course, anything else you want to say. And then after a few minutes of that, we'll join each other up front, pose some questions, and maybe even open it to the room. Esther Dyson.
Good morning, everybody. It's great. So, first of all, thanks to Lexi and Sheila. And the question is, can we bring them and Rochelle and Katie along with us to the Wellville communities? Because that would be really helpful. How many of you here heard Rick talk yesterday? So I don't want to go into a great deal of repetition, but I do want to just give you a few words about how Hiccup got started and where it is now, and then let Rob and all of you engage in conversation. So as Rob explained, I was a mild-mannered, high-tech investor. And in about 2003, 2004, actually I went to a meeting, not exactly like this, but the same sort of combination of good people trying to be inspiring at their very best. It was a Renaissance weekend, New Year's Eve thing. And the theory there is that everybody should be on a panel. So whether it's talking about your travel experiences in India or your rise through the ranks at Boeing, or how it was being governor of some state, all these people were on panels. And that often meant there was a very small audience. So there was a panel about healthcare. There were 20 panelists and 3 of us in the audience. The 20 panelists, they were the nicest, most concerned people. They'd all gone into healthcare through some sense of mission. There was a cancer doc and a hospital administrator, an emergency room nurse. I don't know what, but probably a cancer researcher, whatever, inspiring people. And they all talked about the problems with the healthcare system, the misaligned incentives, the high costs, the unnecessary treatment, the lack of compliance, the huge amounts of expenditures towards drugs that were then used too broadly and very few people benefited. It was a tragedy. And I'm sitting there thinking, boy, if this were a tech conference, we'd have 3 venture capitalists, we'd have 5 people with cures for cancer, we'd have a bunch of people who are going to reorganize hospital workflow. What's with this field? So I started getting more interested in healthcare about the same time as I got less interested in apps to find friends to go to a concert with on Thursday night, which is a completely different market from Tuesday night. And I started investing some in quantified stealth. How many of you are wearing a device of some kind that measures steps or, okay. But you all probably use a scale once in a while. You qualify as quantified selfers. And the thing about quantified self is it's more focused on trying to avoid healthcare rather than to fix it. And there are places for both. Around the same time as I was getting interested in healthcare, there was an idea at the X Prize, which did space travel, and so I knew them partly through being interested in space. There was a healthcare X Prize that was going to be funded by WellPoint, and the idea was to take 5 probably WellPoint patient, WellPoint, the health insurance company, WellPoint patients. And maybe one group would be McKinsey, another group would be some diabetes management service. But these 5 populations would be treated or managed by some entity that would then compete to win the Healthcare X Prize. And the challenge here was that the person running this produced a document that said, of course, measurement is very important, which it is. And if you have a 20% reduction in heart attacks and a 30% reduction in diabetes, for example, you've already got a 50% improvement. You all study math, right? Doesn't quite compute. Anyway, the thing never happened. And I kept thinking, somebody should do this. If only through self-interest, it would be a great place to pilot my quantified self-investments. But I also thought this was what the world really needs. Improve health, reduce cost. And to some extent, that is what Obamacare is about more than just who pays. It's what they're paying for. So nobody stood up to do this. And last year, I was going to give a talk at yet another event. And I thought, I'll talk about how somebody should do a Healthcare X Prize thing. And I realized that is a really lame speech. Somebody comes up and says, somebody else should do something. So I announced it. And then I had to figure out what was I about to do. So I organized 4 brainstorming sessions. Anybody I knew in health/healthcare, I invited them to come or send their friends. And at one of them, really exciting, there was a guy who runs 6 McDonald's franchises. He's kind of our inside mole. We're ready to call on him soon, but not yet. And at another one, there was this guy who showed up, kind of like a smaller, gentler version of Ryan Seacrest, actually. And he kept asking really awkward questions, like, how are you going to fund this thing? How are you going to generate all the data? How are you going to select the communities? So that's Rick Brush. He joined us. And many of you heard him yesterday, and he's here. And he did some great things. First, and continues to do them. First, I came up with the name HICCUP, which stands for Health Initiative Coordinating Council, because I like things that are what their name says, not Onyx or whatever. And I called it HICCUP to make it slightly funny and memorable, but it really didn't send the right message. So that's where Rick created the Way to Wellville. And he created our entire process, which, amazingly, you see up here, this is the timeline. And over the past year, Rick has a background both at Cigna and in asthma prevention. So I've learned a lot more than he has, but we've both learned a lot. And from thinking about health care, we are thinking more and more about starting at the very beginning with diet and nutrition, and not just, quote, a nutrition program in school, but redo school lunch. One of the most exciting conferences I went to this year was School Food Focus, which I thought would be about nutrition and children and diet. It was actually about logistics, procurement, and changing out kitchen equipment in schools. In other words, making change is not theoretical. As Rob said, it's not a 150-page report. It's how do you actually make this work? So there are lots of moving parts we've got. We've got the financing bit. We've got all the different partners, from health systems to local governments to food companies to parks and recreation departments, vendors of various kinds of programs and health devices. But it's kind of hard to do this theoretically. So although we're doing everything in parallel, the place we are farthest along is in selecting the communities. we put out a call for applications. Rick developed this monster 20-page application, which is a long thing to read, even without the data in it. But in a sense, the purpose of the application is to let the communities understand this is not fill in a form and you'll get a prize. This is almost, it's a warning about what you're going to have to know and find out and monitor and change over the next 5 years to be one of the Wellville 5, which is 5 communities competing over 5 years along 5 metrics to dramatically improve the health of their own community. We have a few selection criteria. The most important of them so consider this to be a clinical trial, not of a particular intervention, but of the concept that for any of these interventions to work, you need to have multiple ones working together. The diabetes program will work better if the school lunch is healthy. The asthma prevention program will work better if pollution is reduced. The employer wellness program will work better if the corner shop is selling fruits and vegetables rather than donuts and cream pies. So in order to limit the resources required, but also to get the right mindset, what we're trying to do is not government intrusion. It's not a nice white lady from New York coming and telling people how to live. It's collective action in a community coming together to make something happen. So we're looking for small communities, and they need to be bounded geographically. Everybody asks, well, you know, so this was very different from WellPoint, where they were going to just get a set of customers living sort of interspersed in another population. We're trying to change a whole place, and then we're trying to measure what happens in that place. So we're not going to have people around the edges frisking people for M&Ms, but we are hoping that they will mostly live, work, pray, play, exercise, sleep in that same place. And that's what we put out a call for. We went through whatever partners we could find. And given the fact that we haven't reached everybody and that it's a really long application, we were expecting about 20. And we got 41, or maybe 42, which is another story. But let me show you where they are from. And if any of you comes from any of these places, or raise your hands. Oh my gosh.
I was born in Columbus, Indiana.
Wow. And amazingly, so Columbus, Indiana is the home of Cummins Engine and Arvin Industries. And long, long ago, when I was a reporter for Forbes, I went to Columbus, Indiana to interview Irwin Miller. So each of these places has its own magic. And this afternoon, Rick and I and our team, I don't know, are Lexi and the team going to join us at all? Whatever. Anyway, we've been reading these applications and putting stuff into spreadsheets, but we're trying to winnow it down to about 10 that we will visit, and then ultimately 5. But this is inspiring. The applications are inspiring. Everything's, and we don't want to select 5 and throw the rest away. So we were trying to figure out, well, what should we do with the rest of them? Our initial word was, again, this is my term, second circle. But together we came up with Greater Wellville. So we've got the Wellville 5 and Greater Wellville, and we're going to be trying to figure out how to help them also benefit from all the people who are coming up and saying, how can we help? We have a healthy menu. We have a diabetes prevention program. We have a workflow tool for helping people, once discharged, stay out of the hospital. So Rob, that's where we are now. I don't know where you are.
Right,
and let's sit down.
Great, thanks, Esther. So, this is the hot seat.
Okay.
Great. So one thing I want to say contextually first before we jump in, and this will be a little bit wide-ranging. I'm kind of like, you know, a little kid that just met Mr. Green Jeans or something. I don't know. Anybody remember Mr. Green Jeans? Yeah, okay, well, I do. So if you're from Columbus, Indiana, you know Mr. Green Jeans. But it's something that occurs to me about you, and this has come through in this journey that you were just discussing, is I was in Israel in March with, where's Yitz? Yitz Applebaum. Well, maybe he popped out for a minute. But we took a delegation, a group of Kenyans to Israel to visit the technology community. I'm sure you are well connected there. Amazing place. But one of the things that occurred to us in that trip was there are many things that differentiate the Israeli community from other parts of the world trying to be innovative. And one thing that was front and center, and I didn't get this the first time I was there, is that even though people might be in military, they might be in government, they might be in business, they might be investors, for the most part, they don't put themselves in a box. They don't say, you know what, I'm an investor and that's the role I play. Or I'm at a big corporation and so I'm going to go out seeing the world as a big corporation sees it. They're more facile and they see something interesting and they say, you know, maybe I could do that or maybe I can move in that space. You've done that many times in your life. You just described that process of saying, hey, you know, this healthcare space is interesting, I want to do something of meaning. Tell us a little bit about that transition. How did that transition happen? How did you say, you know, not just, hey, this is interesting, but I'm going to do something about this?
Yeah. Well, unfortunately,
oh, and by the way, I don't make it a habit of commenting on our speakers' attire at all,
right.
But we had the microphones on, and then you put the jacket on.
Okay.
So there you go.
There we go.
There,
okay. So while we're doing logistics, how do I get my chair to lean back like yours?
Oh,
Or
that's.
do I just have to be bigger?
I think I'm just really heavy, to be honest. These are mid-century Herman Miller chairs.
Okay.
So there you go.
So unfortunately, it wasn't so much a transition as an addition. In other words, I'm
Meaning
still
you're
doing.
Still doing all the other
I'm doing
things
the other stuff.
Right. Right.
But Hiccup is now my primary job. As I mentioned, Rick is doing all the work, so it's not so bad. But what is worth noting is that all the stuff I still do and used to do applies here, ranging from going to a tech conference last week, or actually the last 3 days, which is why I wasn't here sooner,
Right.
and meeting ideally some benevolent billionaires and just that whole scene, though I think it's getting very bubbly, is certainly very relevant, the quantified self stuff. I learned a lot about medicine, believe it or not, during my space training, because you really learn two things in space training. One is space plumbing, how to keep the spaceship working, and two is space medicine.
Now wait, Esther, we've got to provide some context. People might say space training. What the heck is this? So what do you mean space training? Where did this come about?
So the reason I'm so curious is both my parents are scientists.
Yeah.
Still?
You know what? So
Okay.
the interviewer will move
Great.
to the other
Okay.
side. Okay,
Thank
good.
you. Okay.
Good. Fortunately, we're rather casual here.
Yeah, and very flexible.
Great.
Good. Okay. So my parents were scientists, and when I was growing up,
Freeman Dyson.
Freeman Dyson,
Yeah.
physics, space travel, whatever.
Right.
I figured he'd taken care of that, and I didn't need to pay any attention. By the time I grew up, everybody would be flying around in rockets, and then, you know, some 30 years later, I discovered, geez, we got to the moon once, or, you know, but we haven't done anything since. So I started getting interested in that and in air taxis, and I ended up, well, maybe you want the story. So, as you heard, I have an extremely busy, fun-filled, exciting life,
Yes.
full of meetings and schedule conflicts. I was at a meeting of the Gates Foundation and got an email from my sister Emily, who is now fine, saying she's a cardiologist. They had discovered cancer in both breasts, and she was about to have a double mastectomy. So I called her, we cried, and as I said, everything worked out okay, or I would never tell this story. 3 weeks later, I was on the phone trying to schedule something or other, and I thought, oh, if I just had a double mastectomy, I could cancel this meeting. And then I genuinely thought that. And then I thought, this is totally crazy. So I called up Space Adventures, which is the company that organizes the space tourist trips, and had been pressing me to pay $3 million to train as a backup.
Yeah, I've been getting those calls too. Always
Anyway,
at dinner. Always
yes,
at dinner.
Always at dinner. It's crazy.
Gosh.
Yeah. If they'd call in the morning, no problem. So I called them up and said, I'm ready. And then I called up my father, and my parents are these wonderful parents who always, whatever you do, go to live in Morocco with your boyfriend at 17. He's in the Peace Corps. I was just after my first year in college. Just sort of abandon the family values, which were that salespeople are the lowest thing, and go work as a reporter for Forbes. Quit my nice job on Wall Street for a pay cut to join a newsletter and conference company. They always would say, that's nice, darling. Anything that makes you happy. So I was kind of expecting that same reaction from my dad when I told him that I was going to train to be backup to Charles Simone. But instead, he got up from the dinner table and jumped for joy. And I realized I'm his firstborn. Going to space has been his dream for 80 years. And it was really wonderful. So I trained for 6 months. I did not go up, but I wasn't buying a lottery ticket. I really did want the experience, both of just learning from the inside, being embedded, ironically, not just with the Russian space program, but with the NASA astronauts who were training there as well.
Wow. So
my father, my stepmother, my brother came out to Kazakhstan to watch the launch. And it was an amazing experience.
Well, so speaking of amazing experiences, you've just to point out to everyone, you've covered a little bit about tech, a little bit about being with Forbes and a conference company, as you called, about healthcare, about space. Can we add anything else to the list here? So I want to ask a pointed question about technology and entrepreneurship, which is close to our heart. You've been in this environment for a while. What are the primary changes you've seen over the past decade or two in technology and as it interfaces with entrepreneurship?
Well, in some sense, the really important things don't change, and those are values, integrity, management skills, all those kinds of things. Probably the biggest thing that has changed in what I do and what I see was when I started out. If you got onto an airplane and you saw somebody with a computer, and in those days they mostly weighed 20 pounds, that was really exciting. Oh, they're one of us. And you could talk to them about MS-DOS or something.
Or heaven forbid they had an Apple Newton. Then you knew you had somebody, yeah.
Yeah. So it used to be something special and apart. And I'll always remember one year, this would have been around 80, I don't know, it was when Steve was at Apple the first time. He came and spoke at my conference, but then he had to leave to go be on the Larry King show. And if you were in the industry at that time, it was a smallish industry, again, of people who were not part of the mainstream. And we all knew Steve Jobs, and many of them, I was kind of neutral because I was running the conference, but many of them, yeah, they really hated him. He was a tough competitor. He was not the kindest person. He could be brusque. He insulted me a number of times. But
I think that means he liked you.
yeah, that was Bill Gates.
Oh, okay.
But so some of us gathered in a room to watch Steve on Larry King. Yeah. And suddenly, he was our guy. He was representing us to the broader world. And he was the best spokesman any industry could ever have. He was awesome. But that feeling that we were all together and he was representing us That's gone. Yeah, now everybody has multiple devices. And at the conference I was just at this week, it was really interesting. They had the CEO of Comcast. And one question was about Comcast strategy vis-a-vis Netflix and all this. And the next question was some guy complaining because his service costs too much or his cable box.
You mean a question from the audience?
Yeah, I mean, but it was just so different because all these things are now mainstream and the industry doesn't really fit in a single conference. So you can have 20 top CEOs and still be missing half the important people in the industry.
But that seems to be a good thing, right? It means the industry is expanding, maturing,
oh, yeah.
more people in the tent.
Yeah, I mean, it's not as much fun. And frankly, fixing health is a lot more fun and a lot more meaningful.
So it sounds like meaning and fun have something to do with your equation for deciding what's going to happen next for Esther Dyson?
Yeah.
So tell us about a specific experience or a pivotal moment, something you're going along with your diverse life and you experience something. It could have been a failure, it could have been a shocking moment, it's something where you turned and you said, I need to go that direction, or I need to rethink. Share something where your mind changed.
Well, changing your mind. The two best ones were actually that conference in New Year's 2004, and then sort of calling my own bluff and starting Hiccup. Trying to think of a good one that's both intimate and, so changing my mind.
Yeah.
I wrote a book in 1996 called Release 2.0.
Yeah.
And
it had the picture of your face on the front,
yeah.
right? Profile.
Profile.
Yeah.
Yeah. And
see?
I don't like reading stuff I've written, but I suspect if I went back, I would agree with most of what was in there, except for anonymity.
What do you mean?
Well, so I wrote a chapter on privacy and one on anonymity, and the privacy one was kind of the tension between privacy and openness and people's right to know. That I think the thing they did in Europe last week about the right to be forgotten is I mean, not only is it wrong, it's brain dead. Because I'm a big fan of transparency and people's right to know rather than people's right to be forgotten. But at the same time, I thought anonymity was great. For whistleblowers, for the fact, if the world were perfect, you wouldn't need anonymity. And if every child was wanted and conceived in love, you wouldn't need abortion. But the world is not perfect. And I won't go into abortion, but anonymity is sometimes necessary in places where people are stigmatized, in places where people in power do evil things and need to be called to account, but you need some anonymity to do that. And I thought, anonymity online would be really nice because people could explore and try out other identities and all this. But it turned out that anonymity at scale creates cesspools. So over time...
Explain what you mean by that. Anonymity at scale creates cesspools. Explain what you mean by that.
Well, there are now a bunch of online services, Whisper and Secret, where people can post stuff anonymously. And you can avoid them, but if someone writes about you in them, truthfully but harmfully or untruthfully, anonymity allows for offensive weapons, so to speak. And I still think it's something that should be possible at times, but I don't think everything is black and white. And on that spectrum of black to white, I thought anonymity was here on the white side, and I now think it's over here on the black side. Doesn't mean outlaw it. It does mean discourage it. Don't foster services that encourage people to behave badly.
So it sounds like you think there's some sort of a responsibility of business, whether it's a startup or organization and nonprofits, et cetera, to self-police.
Yeah, there's a responsibility of people to be people with values rather than simply say this institution, you can't infringe on my rights. The whole point I'm trying to say in a sense is these are not absolute things in either direction. But if there were such absolutes, the world could be run by machines. There are not. You need people with integrity, but more than that, courage to stand up for what's right and to, we shouldn't need to have a law against everything that's bad. We should have social codes, and we shouldn't think that those social codes mean nothing. They mean a lot.
This is partly about creating a healthy civil society. I remember at our first Kin Global, we featured Colombia, and we have 17 Colombians here in the room, in fact. And they had just gone through an extraordinary transformation. The government had come close to collapse. The FARC was on the doorstep of Bogota. It was an incredibly difficult time, and there was a fellow there who later ran for president, was mayor of Bogota, named Antanas Mocus. And he said, you know what, it's great to build more schools, have more police, et cetera, but our underlying problem right now is that we're lacking civil society. And how do we rebuild society? How do we rebuild that sense of civility? And I won't go into it now, but he did some incredibly cheap and powerful things to make that civility happen. So one brief example was he created soccer ref cards, because he said Colombians love soccer. This is a Catholic society. We respond to guilt, and we love to express our opinions. And he said he created 300,000 ref cards, red on one side with a thumbs down, green on the other side with a thumbs up. And he handed them out to 5% of the population and said, you're now a ref. And every time you see someone do something bad, hold up the red card and point at them, which is rather dangerous in Bogota, by the way. And if you see them do something good, hold up the green side of the card. And you know what? People loved it.
Yes.
They couldn't wait to pull that card out of their pocket and point at somebody. People started trading the cards. People started making their own cards, like bootleg soccer ref cards. And I have lots of Colombian friends, and they've all verified that this almost free initiative had an impact on the civility of society. So Esther, as we go through, you're someone who thinks of the future, and in businesses it's tough for us to have the time to think 2 or 3 years out in many cases. You think 5 or 50 or, I don't know, 1,000 years out from time to time. What does the next decade look like? I know this is a big question, but what do you think is important, salient for us as human beings, as citizens, as business leaders, et cetera, to think about 10 years from now over that process? As technology is changing much more rapidly than any of us really recognize. So as citizens, what should we know? What should we be looking for or paying attention to?
Okay, well, first of all, that is an awesome idea, and we may well steal it.
Please.
But
in fact, we'd be happy to introduce you to Antanas Mocus's nonprofit in Bogota. They can tell you all the stupid things they did that didn't work, and then all the stupid things they did that did work.
And just as actually with Wellville, we're hoping people will steal our ideas, because there was a lot of discussion about scale, and you can scale a business this way, but health and civil society, you actually need to scale this way.
What do you mean by that? Scale this way. What does that mean?
Well, the purpose of Hiccup is not to go run communities. The purpose of Hiccup is to run a contest so that lots of communities, so some mayor 5 years from now will be sitting in her office and she'll be thinking, we can do only one municipal bond. Should we fund the bike paths, or should we fund the school lunch changeover? And some Kellogg grad will come into the office, the young administrator of something or other, and this Kellogg grad will say, well, but Mayor, at Wellville they showed that if you do the bike paths and the school lunch, you actually save money on your city health care costs, and you get more taxes because more people are working. So we can do both.
So how can I have my healthy school lunch and eat it too, so to
Yes.
speak? Great. But I'm not going to let you evade this question. Two things. First of all, I really want to understand, what does scale like this mean? You're talking about grassroots
Yeah,
scaling?
grassroots, bottom up.
Ah, right.
Each community does it for themselves,
Right.
rather than following, you know, some top-down model, or even it's much more like viral change than kind of replicated change.
But I think a lot of business leaders could take a cue from that, because sometimes you need the top-down directive, and sometimes you need to figure out how to put fuel on existing fires.
Yeah.
To find a few things smoldering, but they don't have enough energy, and throw something on them. And that creates a ground up as well. Even in a corporation, you can do that.
Yeah, it's kind of like Bill Gates used to talk a lot about the digital nervous system. And I prefer to talk about the digital immune system. The identity is in every cell of whatever it is. It's not, it doesn't come from the brain. It actually, it's kind of spread and replicated everywhere, ideally.
So that's a good transition back to my question, which is 10 years,
future,
as citizens, what do we need to know about where things are going over the next decade or so with technology?
Honestly, I think tech is overrated. The technology, the purpose of tech companies is to make the tech usable for people who don't have to go study programming. What they do need to study is logic and statistics, and of course humanities and courage and so forth. But the world is getting much more complicated. And you could say there are problems in Washington with political gridlock, whatever. But we elected these people. And we need to understand statistics better. We need to understand which campaign promises to believe and which not to believe. We need a better educated populace about thinking clearly, asking for facts, understanding people's motivations, much more than we need even people who know how to program.
That's interesting, because you hear, I'm all for coding. I'm all for kids learning how to code. I did some coding in my graduate program. I'm glad I never have to do it again. I just happen to be someone who doesn't like coding myself. But I'm concerned often, I think like you are, that it becomes an easy answer.
Yeah.
So people are saying, oh man, how do we build a workforce for the future? You know what? Teach them how to code. And that's great, but you just said logic, statistics, that's hard stuff.
Yeah.
Darn it, that's hard.
Not if,
Humanities, what use could you possibly have for humanities? Come on.
so the thing about statistics is, I'll reveal my ignorance. I don't know what your sports teams are.
You mean here at Northwestern?
Yeah.
Football, basketball,
No, I
we
mean what
lose
their
at everything.
names are.
What? Huh? Oh, Wildcats.
Wildcats. Okay.
Wildcats, yeah.
So if it's the Wildcats, people can probably understand statistics.
Meaning the
They
game
know what it
stats.
means. If they know what the scores mean, they can predict somebody's average. They can do probability.
Mm-hmm.
You just need a topic that is of interest,
To tie them
and then you
to,
can do amazing things.
Right.
So it's actually not that hard. But it does require you to sit down and think rather than look at videos all the time.
So talk about that. I mean, this concerns me quite a bit. I do look at videos and social media and all this.
And now
but
you can't think anymore.
I'm sorry, what? I wasn't. I'd like a puppy. Anyone have it? I'm sorry.
No, cats.
Cats. Oh, sorry, cats.
LOL.
But what about this? What about this rising gen? In fact, I just heard an acronym that I have disdain for, and it scares me. And it's TLTR. Do you know what that is? Too long to read. TLTR.
Or TL didn't read.
Yeah, TL didn't
TLD.
read. Yeah,
Yeah.
too long didn't read. TLDR.
Or TMI.
Well, yeah, we got a lot of TMI going on here at the Kin. But so what do we do about this? Because this generation that's coming up, and Esther, I just started saying this a few years ago, the younger generation. I can't believe I'm
Yeah,
saying
I
that,
know.
but I am. So
Those kids.
Those kids, yeah. I mean, phenomenal hope for the future. Some of the things they're able to do are things that we could never imagine doing. Creating their own expressions, creating their own businesses in some cases with very little capital. That's all exciting. But at the same time, we have issues with attention span. And we have issues with depths of thinking. Some of the humanities, are at stake. What do we do? And I'm not trying to get you to sign up for another mission, by the way. Healthcare is great.
Yeah.
Wellness is great. Okay.
Yeah, this is the big challenge, and we make we broader. It can't be just
we make we broader. What does that mean?
We make we broader. It doesn't mean just those of us here at an elite university. It means somehow spreading a sense of responsibility much more broadly, so that the American ethos of independence and freedom is great, but it may have gone a little too far over vis-a-vis community. It's civic society. If I were redesigning the world, I'd probably focus a lot on local government, local transparency, so that people get into the habit, again, of collective action that's not seen as government intrusion from faraway bureaucrats, but something that the people want for themselves. We want our kids to be better educated. We want them to work together to create a good community. So it's a combination of leaving too much to the bureaucrats, both positively and negatively. Our laws are so complicated because given again, the political gridlock, nothing will happen that is not prescribed by law. Nothing that is not allowed in law is capable of happening, so that people can't apply good judgment anymore. If you're in a town and you're building a sports facility, you probably don't need as much legal mumbo jumbo, because everybody kind of knows what they want and they can see the thing being built. But if you make a law in Washington, you want to make sure that, so somehow we need to be more distributed, but also have a greater sense of ownership locally.
This immune system concept metaphor coming up again. So in our remaining time, I want to ask you, as someone who meets a lot of people and collects insights and makes connections, which I think if you've been paying attention, you've noticed a lot of those connections throughout Esther's commentary. Who are a few of the people or a couple of the people whom you admire today, whom you say, I want to keep track of those people? And it's great, of course, to say the Elon Musks of the world. I mean, that's sort of obvious. Great respect for Elon Musk. His brother Kimball was here yesterday. But are there a couple people right underneath there, a couple people that you say, wow, she's really got it going on? Who are the people we should be paying attention to?
Okay, well, until you said watch what they're going to do next, the first person I thought of was actually Katharine Graham, who was she married the guy who owned the Washington Post. Yeah. And then when he committed suicide, she took over the Washington Post. She turned it into a good business. She stood up to the government and to Richard Nixon over Watergate. She built a great journalistic enterprise. And her son, Don Graham, actually, I saw him 2 days ago, the guy who sold the Washington Post to Jeff Bezos. The values of building a real organization, of journalistic integrity, of transparency, of standing up to power are awesome. She came to speak at my conference. I don't know when it was, but this was a typical tech conference. It was 90% guys. Most of them were techies, had never heard of her. They gave her a standing ovation, and that's the only one we've ever had. It was amazing. But people who are alive, there are bunches you will hear of eventually. I'm thinking of a young woman called Ginny Kim, who is one of the 6 people who went to Washington to fix healthcare.gov.
Oh, that's fun.
Yes, and that was pretty awesome. She used to work at Google. Sergey Brin himself I love what they're doing at Google X. It's Bell Research, part of AT&T, did amazing things for technology and ultimately for the economy. They, you know, all the telephone system, modems, all this kind of stuff. I think driverless cars, but also the mentality that is excited about driverless cars. It doesn't sort of think, well, there are probably laws against this, we won't bother.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, as a father of a 3-year-old and a 4.5-year-old, I can't wait for the driverless car.
Yeah.
So we're coming down on time, Esther, but I want to throw you a curveball. This is going to be tough, but I know you're up to it. I'd like you to, in a sentence, in only one sentence, maybe 3 or 4 words, summarize for us the meaning of your life.
It ain't over yet.
Great. So Esther, early on in our discussion, you mentioned your sister having breast cancer. And Stephanie and I had that same experience with our sister Deborah, my youngest sister. When you're the oldest brother, you always think of your youngest sister, and she's incredibly successful and powerful and meaningful. And to get that call and say, no, that's not possible, you're my baby sister. She was 35. She had a double mastectomy. I'm proud, pleased, and grateful, thankful to say that she, as your sister is in wonderful shape today. And this weekend is her 5th anniversary post-treatment, cancer-free. So a few things that have always impressed me about you, and I have a better understanding of them now, is making connections. You collect things in your head and make those connections. If Joseph Schumpeter called innovation new combinations, but not just combinations between technologies, combinations between capabilities, technologies, and market needs, things that might help. And you're making those connections all the time. This is something we all have to become better at, and I would guess that none of us, or nearly none of us, were trained in our careers to understand how to transfer and translate, how to take something from one environment and move it into another one, how to take something from tech and move it to healthcare, how to take something from humanities and move it into an engineering environment. That transfer and translate mechanism is one of the most powerful skills we can have, and we don't train anybody to do it. You've got that naturally. I was inspired by all the words that courage, integrity, civil society, logic, statistics. It's hard to be inspired by logic and statistics, perhaps, but critical to have that critical thinking capability, and the fact that the humanities remains in perhaps is even more relevant and important today. How do we make more of that happen? You said we make we broader. I like that. I'm going to use it, and I'll provide attribution, don't worry. And the sense that we have to recover a sense of responsibility for our civil society, for the decisions we make, etc. And you've illustrated that by your actions multiple times in saying, I'm not going to get up and get a speech and say that somebody else should do this. I'm going to do it myself and bring people along with me. Thanks a lot, Esther, for your time.
Thank you. You sound so wonderful.
Thank you.